June 9, 2001, 7:05 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time, Paul Smith's. New York. A chartered yellow bus pulled away from the campus and rolled toward the Five Ponds wilderness. Then never checked in. What happened to Claire Monroe and the 26 classmates who waved from those windows? 22 years later, June 12, 2023, 6:42 a.m. A storm-scoured trail in Adirondack Park offered up something the forest had buried. Not yet, no spoilers. Truth should arrive on its own feet. The logs show no road wide enough. The maps show no route at all. Yet something moved that bus. You'll hear the first heartbeat of the answer today. Ask yourself who opened the door. And why. The last senior bonfire was supposed to be loud and ordinary. The kind of night that fades into anecdotes and boxed photographs. On the lawn outside Paul Smith's college, caps hung from backpack straps. And the air smelled like rain pressed flat by pine. Claire carried the speech she never read. Its margins crowded with edits in blue ink and a quote she swore she believed. Leave the shore. Make the crossing. Mason Reed filmed everything with a high -8 he'd bought in a pawn shop. Talking to the lens in quick bursts. Promising to splice there, last summer, into something worth rewatching. Marcus Hale stood a little apart. Shoulders squared. A scholarship letter folded in his pocket until the paper remembered the crease. Naomi Trin kept her sketchbook closed but held it like a secret. Thumb finding the soft groove in the cardboard spine. They left before dusk because Dr. Lowell Keats said dusk tricks your judgment. And Ms. Jenna Caro didn't like driving after dark on two-lane roads. The driver was a replacement. Mr. Howard Briggs, a man with forearms like tree roots and a voice that sounded borrowed from gravel. The class photo at the curb showed bright smiles and raincoats. The college seal in the glass behind them. A frame around a promise that should have been boring. There is a mercy in boring. People say, not that night. The voicemail landed at 7:41 p.m. on a mother's answering machine. Nothing you'd remember unless you were waiting for it. Wind, a laugh, not unkind, a male voice, maybe Mason's, saying, kill the light, then a scrape, then silence, then static, no goodbye, no hang up. It lived there, 30 seconds of guesswork, and played back so many times the tape warped around it. When the bus failed to arrive at the ranger check-in, the explanations stacked themselves like kindling. Missed turn, bad shoulder, fog rolling down from ponds that don't care what you planned. Search and rescue drew grids and learned the place anew, the pushback of spruce. The way water braids and unbraids in a single afternoon. How tires leave marks until the forest decides you're done. Helicopters spun circles that made no difference. The chain of lakes kept their own counsel. The dogs tried, then lay down and blinked as if they'd misplaced the world. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived without a postmark. We made it, please stop looking. The words staggered across the page in a handwriting almost, but not quite, familiar. Parents learned what forensic document examiners say when the answer is still a no. Almost is not enough. Hope and dread sat at the same table and wouldn't make eye contact. Time did what time does when it is instructed to heal and refuses. The college mounted a plaque in the main hall, 27 names. 2 faculty. A blank line where prayers tick the seconds. Each June, candles trembled a little in the lobby crosswind. Claire's father, Mayor Thomas Monroe, never signed the declaration of death. Absence is not the same as gone. He told any reporter who dared to pretend they were different words. Then the summer storms of 2023 tore through the western Adirondacks like a hand clearing a crowded table. In the washed-out light of early morning, a trail steward working a damage sweep cut through a blowdown and saw yellow that wasn't lichen. A window rim, a rusted curve. He stood there long enough for the mosquitoes to pick their marks and then radioed what sounded impossible with the plainest language he had. Possible school bus. Off-mapped corridor, request perimeter and forensic team. The approach took hours because the terrain insisted, and the path they chose had to be invented. The first responders worked in 3-sentence bursts, watch the route. Hold the handline, mind the edge, until the wreckage opened to them like a chest someone forgot to lock. The door wouldn't budge, then did. Air that didn't belong to this season tumbled out. Seats half peeled and upholstered by moss. Fabric surrendered to mildew. A jacket still showing the college crest if you wiped it with your sleeve. On the floor, the ordinary detritus of young adults who expected the next mile to be what the previous one had promised. Somewhere under the driver's seat, plastic clicked against a boot. No one said the word miracle. No one said the word tomb. They catalogued instead. They measured, photographed, lifted, placed, noted, sealed. All the verbs that keep grief from running the room. Every object a story without a narrator. Every angle a question that refused to come in from the rain. An investigator traced his finger along a seam and looked back the way they had come. There was no corridor for a vehicle this size. Not now, not then. The creek bed was too narrow in both directions. The firs on either side showed decades of growth uninterrupted. The math wouldn't compute unless a missing value, something with steel teeth and patience, had been here at the right hour, in the right drought. The forest does not confess. It hints. It saves. Sometimes, it hides. Often, in the middle distance, cloud shadow slid across a stand of hemlock like a thought you can't catch. The steward who made the call stood apart and pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth. An old habit that keeps panic from speaking. He looked down at the ground and saw strange straightness where there should have been none. The kind of line only machines draw. He didn't step closer. He just said, softly, "That's not erosion," and let the radio do the rest. They tagged and bagged the ordinary first. Because ordinary tells the truth when nothing else will. A green windbreaker stamped with the college crest. 2 water bottles that still rattled when shaken. A spiral charm carved from softwood. Broken clean where a cord had once threaded through. The lab called before noon. Partial DNA profiles from bone fragments and tooth pulp matched 17 names engraved on the hall plaque. It steadied the room and split it in the same breath. Closure for some felt like betrayal to others. The sheriff didn't say the words on camera, but everyone heard them anyway. We have the dead. And we have the missing. 9 students. 2 faculty. No sign of Dr. Lowell Keats. No trace of Ms. Jenna Caro. The list circulated in kitchens before it reached the press. People underlined the names they loved as if ink could hold a life in place. At the Monroe home, Claire's toothbrush remained by the sink. Thomas Monroe polished the metal plate on her childhood trunk and told himself shine as a promise. He still spoke about her in the present tense because verbs matter when you're teaching your heart which timeline to live in. Grief built routines. Every June, candles shook in the lobby's crosswind, and alumni set their palms on the stone like a pledge. Mason Reed's mother never touched the plaque. She wore his film festival lanyard under her collar and waited near the exit like he might come late to his own memorial. Marcus Hale's brother kept Marcus's old cleats in the trunk of his car. Not as a talisman, he said, but because he never found the nerve to give them away. Naomi Trin's best friend brought graphite pencils to the shore at Osgood Pond and dropped them into the reeds one by one. A tiny ceremony for a hand that might still be drawing somewhere out of sight. The investigators read the room differently. They were trained to translate sadness into timelines. The voicemail's 7:41 p.m. timestamp. The bus's departure angle from the campus loop. The absence of a check-in call at the ranger gate. They pinned the blue minutes in a long row and looked for the one that blinked. Evidence pointed to a thing no one wanted to say aloud. The bus had not wandered into the woods and died. It had been placed, and placed with care. That spiral charm under the rear bench wouldn't let go of them. It wasn't store-bought. It wasn't part of a craft kit. The cut pattern spiraled inward twice, then reversed, a mirrored helix that felt decorative until you measured it. The curves mapped to nothing in folklore tables but looked suspiciously like waterlines when you overlaid them on hydro maps. If you didn't know the 5 ponds back channels, you'd call it art. If you did, you might call it directions. They opened the MiniDisc without breaking it, which felt like surgery on a time capsule. The locked screen asked for 4 digits. Mason, who always made jokes when he was nervous, had cataloged the obvious codes in a notebook years before: birthdays, area codes, locker combos, the campus SIP. The lab tech scrolled past them all. No one entered the number. Not yet. A thing unopened can still be hope. People whispered the soft accusations tragedy invites. Why did they leave before dusk? Why switch drivers at the last minute? Why keep the route quiet except for a paper itinerary no one could find? Those questions rubbed raw old arguments. Dr. Keats believed the wilderness made better citizens, his faculty files said so. Ms. Caro believed structure prevented panic. They had argued before about risk and reward and the difference between challenge and harm. On paper, they agreed. In practice, compromise is a slow knife. The campus remained a village after the headline left. In the dining hall line, someone always left space for one more tray. A bench by the boathouse carried the etched initials of people who didn't make it to their someday. A freshman who had never met any of them learned to tie a bowline because Marcus taught it on a grainy VHS. The loop tightening cleanly against the standing line like a promise you could see. Late one night, a ranger pulled an old incident log from a plastic bin and slid it across a desk to the forensic acoustics consultant the county had hired on a grant. The entry was short, almost an afterthought. June 2002, pre-dawn, north of Sand Lake, heard singing, low, uniform, no words, couldn't fix direction. The consultant hooked headphones around her neck and cued the MiniDisc's first track while the storm rattled against the window. It opened with air and footfall, a cadence like someone counting breaths with their heel. Then a tone that wasn't quite a note, more a pressure that made your ribs behave. She slowed the file and stripped the frequencies one by one until a band remained that matched the ranger's description to 4 decimals. Noise is random. Patterns get their own gravity. Some mysteries hurl themselves at you. This one leaned close and asked if you were listening right. What if the charm wasn't a keepsake, but a key? They tested the idea everyone hated first. Maybe the bus had bounced down a forgotten track and died where it landed. Terrain analysts walked the perimeter with clinometers and laser rangefinders. Then sketched the impossible. The firs on either side were the age of a small mortgage. Their root plates locked the soil like keystones. No vehicle that size got through without tearing a corridor. And the corridor wasn't torn. What cut through the wilderness was a straighter line. Faint and stubborn. The kind machines leave when the operator trusts the ground more than the map. A hydrologist traced that line to a seasonal outflow, an old flood chute that wakes in drought and roars in spring. If you knew it, you could use it, if you used it once. A month later, the water would erase your trail like a blackboard wiped clean. They rappelled into the chute in teams of 2, moving slow, hands brushing the walls for stories the eye missed. 10 minutes in, a glint answered the sun. A tooth of metal lodged in silt at the bend. It wasn't a rock. It had teeth of its own. A winch cog, scaled with rust, the kind bolted onto rigs that haul timber or heavy equipment. 27 meters farther, a wire rope lay slumped like a snake that forgot its body. Strands kinked where tension had once been king. The cable had failed clean. Not frayed, sheared and later corroded. The broken end told a history of load, angle, patience. In this place, someone had dragged something heavy against gravity and gotten away with it. On paper, the chain of causation tightened. An early summer window in 2001 had set water levels low and banks hard. A second window in late fall would have carried debris and silt to dress the wound. Between those windows lived the time to move a bus without a road. The sheriff's office pulled weather logs and dam release schedules while a ranger with 30 seasons in his bones closed his eyes and pictured the sound. Steel speaking to rock when the river runs thin. The cable's manufacturer stamp came back to a distributor 3 counties south. The sort of invoice that never makes the front page. Catalog numbers sometimes sing if you let them. The distributor had filled a large order in June 2001 for a job site near Cranberry Lake. 2 spools of galvanized wire rope, 2 portable fairleads, shackles, gloves, a tin of cutting compound. The contractor name on the receipt belonged to a sawmill that changed ownership twice and closed in 2004. The new owner remembered a forklift that coughed through every shift and a foreman who liked cash. He did not remember where the extra spools went when the books were cleaned before the sale. He did remember a rumor that the foreman spent weekends helping the off-gridders with access problems the county didn't recognize. Off-gridders meant a cottage industry of camps that paid their taxes in quiet. It did not, by itself, mean threat, but words shovel their own channels. A retired firecrewman who ran radios as a hobby came forward with a spiral notebook of frequencies scribbled in pencil. He had logged a narrowband transmission in August 2003, short burst. Male voice. 3 syllables slurred by panic. Followed by numbers that sounded like counting or code. The transmission wrote a sub-audible tone. A CTCSS squelch that filtered noise. The number matched the tone preset on a consumer-grade two-way many students used for field labs back then. Marcus Hale had prided himself on teaching half the campus to program theirs for fun. He'd called it the difference between a dead battery and a conversation. When they overlaid the retired crewman's location with the hydrology model, the line landed between 2 ridges that behaved like walls, bending sound into a pocket where echoes stacked. That might explain why the Rangers' 2002 report described singing that wasn't singing. Just a held note, a body's attempt to make distance shrink. The acoustics consultant mapped the reflections and used them to triangulate an area no one had searched properly. It was less than half a mile from the bus as the crow flies. Twice that as a person slips and crawls. They went in with the kind of discipline that keeps people from getting hurt. No heroics, no declaring closure before the ground speaks. The first flag they placed was not for a human trace, but for the aftermath of a machine. A gouge hidden under duff where a fairlead might have dug in and pivoted. The second flag went at a bald patch on a route where braided steel had kissed the wood. The third marked a pocket of soil with an attitude. Dirt tells the truth when it is moved out of season. Probe rods found a crust. Then a give. Then a layer that didn't match the leaf litter above it. No bones. Nothing you could call an answer. Just the suggestion of a floor where the forest insisted there shouldn't be one. What took the air out of the clearing was smaller than a body. A string of carved discs in the leaves. The same spiral Naomi Trin had drawn in charcoal months before she vanished. Each disc spaced evenly like a metronome through the brush, leading not away from the bus but sideways, toward the seam where 2 flood channels meet at a knuckle of higher ground. Someone had laid a path that only made sense if you believed water was both obstacle and road. Someone had understood the woods like a language and written a sentence they expected no one else to read. The team chief looked up and saw a high snag wired with old paracord. A makeshift anchor that had once supported a tarp. A camp, then, not a long-term one, the kind you throw up to do work and erase after. He stood there and felt the shape of a plan that had spanned a season. Not a night. Whoever moved the bus knew the windows in the river, the patience of trees, and the price of time. They marked the knuckle and called in ground-penetrating radar, not because they wanted to, but because the facts had walked them there, when the unit hummed alive and the first lines painted themselves on the tablet. A technician swallowed and pointed to a symmetry the Earth rarely gives without help. The pattern was not a void, not yet, but it had edges you could measure. If a confession existed in this forest, it might be speaking here. The man who walked into the Tupper Lake station looked like he'd slept in wind. Lean, hollow around the eyes, beard cut with a pocket knife, clothes a size too big because food hadn't been a fact for long stretches. He gave his name in a voice that seemed to apologize for surviving. Mason Reed. The desk sergeant didn't laugh or gasp. He reached for the quiet steps, ID, prints, a swab, because procedure holds the room steady when memory can't. The computer said what the sergeant wouldn't match. The swab said the same. Mason sat in an interview room with a paper cup trembling between his hands while a storm worked its palm across the roof. He didn't start with the bus. He started with the rule they gave it, no past tense. The people who found them called themselves several things: stewards, keepers, walkers, but never leaders. They claimed the land had authority and they only listened better than most. Food arrived first, a thin stew that smelled like cedar and something bitter you couldn't name. Then blankets, then a prohibition. No names from before, no talk of towns. Don't say college, don't say parents, don't say June, we're here now, they'd say, and now would move if you followed it hard enough. At night, sleep came in slices. They assigned shifts the way you assign chores. By voice more than vote. Lights out didn't mean darkness. Because there were no lights. Just the rhythm they called, the cadence. A pattern of waking and resting that untied your sense of time without you noticing it at first. If you asked about leaving, they smiled like you were telling a joke about the ocean drying up. If you said you were going anyway, they gave you the walk. 2 people at your sides at dawn. No rope, no shouting, just direction, just the sound of your own boots learning a trail you hadn't chosen. Some came back quieter, some didn't come back and were not spoken of because speech built bridges and the point was to burn them. He remembered Claire once, not as a symbol, as a person. She asked if anyone else tasted metal in the tea. He lied and said no because it felt like mercy to let her believe she might be imagining the dullness creeping over her thoughts. He remembered Marcus arguing about radio etiquette under his breath, hands moving in the dark like he was programming an invisible dial. He remembered Naomi drawing where there was no paper, tracing spirals in the dirt with a twig and wiping them away when footsteps approached. He remembered Ms. Caro counting heads as if numbers could be a wall. He remembered Dr. Keats negotiating outcomes no one had agreed were on the table. The place had its own vocabulary: cleansing, adjusting, shedding. No talk of sacrifice, no theatrics. They weren't monsters. Monsters announced themselves. They were administrators of scarcity. They believed restraint was an ethic and enforced it with a kind of patience that felt like love until you tried to exercise a choice. They prized repetition. They sang without words to knit the group's breathing. They named clearings, not people. They could wait a season for the river to say yes. "How did you leave?" the investigator asked. But the better question was why he hadn't sooner. Shame wears practical clothes. Mason said the rain did it. A week of it. Fat drops chewing at the edges of everything. The flood chute turned navigable in reverse, slick, loud, a noise to hide inside. He followed the same logic the winch had, only downhill. He ruined his hands and his knees and his faith in his own courage. Then found a hunting camp with a busted television that only got weather. He curled behind a tarp for 2 days trying to will himself into a smaller animal. He stayed off grids because the group had taught him grids were a net and because he couldn't bear the question marks lined up behind his name. He came back because the bus did. "You don't understand," he said, voice cracking and then refusing to crack again. "They win when the forest does all the talking. It keeps them clean." He placed something on the table wrapped in a bandana gone soft from years of pocket sweat. A coil of woven cord with a disc at the end. The same spiral carved into it as the charms under the bench. He had taken it the week he left and hated himself in both directions for doing it and not doing more. They used these to mark the cadence. He said, 2 turns, then back. If you followed the curve with your feet, you ended where they wanted you. The room held its breath because the disc in his palm was a bridge back into the bus. Back under the driver's seat where the MiniDisc had waited like a locked throat. The investigator asked for numbers. 4 digits, Mason said. He didn't look away. He didn't smile at his own audacity. The day the ceremony got moved. The day we were supposed to speak and the rain shut the loud part down. Not the original date, the rained out one. You don't forget the day you were going to say goodbye and didn't. The lab tech retrieved the player, pressed the tiny buttons that still remembered their job, and waited for the chirp that meant the world might finally tell the next sentence out loud. They entered the 4 digits like a dare. A soft click, a brief whir, and then the past breathed into the room, air, footfall, something rubbed against canvas, a hush that was not silence so much as discipline. On speakers turned low, the beginning sounded harmless. When the lab stretched the spectrum, the harmless turned deliberate, a pulse beneath the ambient, 57 hertz. Then 57 again, then a measured rise like someone tapping a metronome on the ribs. Between those taps, a faint chuff and drag that matched boots pulling through wet ground. Don't listen for words, the acoustics consultant said. Listen for the room. She peeled back bands until the mix separated. A frog chorus swelled in one lane. The kind that peaks just before first light in late June at this elevation. In another lane, a distant water braid spoke in the small stones it moved. In the lowest lane lived a tone that wasn't natural resonance. Someone was holding a note. Not singing it, breath steady, throat still, until other breath falls joined and made the air behave. They carried the MiniDisc and a tablet into a smaller lab where walls don't add their own opinions. Mapping the frog calls against biological surveys gave them an hour window. 3:07 to 3:41 a.m. Mapping the water against discharge gauges narrowed it to a night when outflow from an upstream sluice made the flood chute murmur like a slow zipper. Then the consultant did a thing even the detectives leaned forward for. She folded the low tone over itself to see where it interfered and where it cooperated. The interference peaks formed a pattern that refused randomness. The spacing mirrored the spiral carved on the wooden charms recovered under the bus bench. 2 turns, then back, 2 turns, then back, a cadence you could walk if someone wanted your feet to learn a shape. They laid Naomi Trin's charcoal spirals beside the hydrology overlay. What looked like art became topography if you accepted that she had been drawing what she felt rather than what she saw. Twin channels twisting toward a knuckle of higher ground where the flood lost interest and left a lip of safety in certain seasons. A ranger who had lost arguments to that landscape nodded once. That bump throws water east in drought, he said, gives you a dry seam if you know the day. A small team moved before noon. No speeches, stakes, flagging, clean tools, a rule against digging deeper than the law allows until the instruments go first. The knuckle was nothing to look at unless you'd been chasing it for weeks. A shoulder of earth where 2 phantom streams met and disagreed. The first sweep with ground-penetrating radar washed noise onto a tablet. Then sketched order underneath. Rectangles do not belong to forests. Neither do edges that hold their courage under wet soil. A tech traced 9 repeating anomalies with a stylus, each the size of a backpack, arranged like a geometry problem someone didn't want solved. The room that wasn't a room went very quiet. They opened only the surface, lawful, careful, gloved, because you do not hurry a ground that might be holding people you promised to bring home gently. Under leaf litter and a skin of root filament, they found a scatter of evidence that felt more like instructions than trash. Nails bent at right angles as if wrenched from a frame. A paracord scrap faded to sun bleach and creek scour. A shard of bark shaved smooth on one side and soot dark on the other where heat had taught it a lesson. And then, under a mat of pine needles spared by the last storm, a mask large enough for an adult face, carved from birch, empty where eyes should be, edges rubbed by hands that used it more than once. No blood, no spectacle, nothing to feed the worst hunger in a viewer. Just objects that quietly admitted work had been done here that did not want witnesses. Back in the lab, the MiniDisc kept offering. At 12 minutes 30 seconds, a second tone joined the first, slightly flat, then corrected as if the body learning it was new to the discipline. At 16 minutes, the footfalls multiplied and settled into 4s. At 19, a series of clicks regular enough to be hand-carved beads striking each other as an arm swung. The investigator counted between the clicks and found the same interval as the gaps between the radar anomalies on the tablet. Naomi's charcoal wasn't a warning. It was a map that waited 22 years for the right questions. The distributor's records finally coughed up an address attached to the 2001 equipment order, an outbuilding behind a sawmill. Registered now as storage, then as MISC, maintenance. Deputies drove out expecting dust and found a false wall behind a rack of dull chainsaw bars. On the other side, 2 manual fairleads, a spool remnant of the same cable found in the flood chute, and a ledger that wasn't a ledger so much as a calendar with marks on days where water levels would have cooperated. No names, no doctrine, just timing, just craft. It is harder to prosecute craft than belief. One more gift arrived from the past. This one electronic and almost petulant. A forgotten campus computer tower, stored in a back room when the college upgraded labs, refused to boot until an IT tech bribed it with parts. Inside, a folder labeled B-Side Mason held practice clips he'd cut for fun, metronome tests, cadence counts, a walking rhythm he joked would be good for rituals of endurance. Naomi's voice in the background said, "You always end up where you started if you don't choose the turn." Then laughed like she wanted him to know she was half kidding. It wasn't a confession. It was proof they understood patterns before someone weaponized them. At sunset, the team returned to the knuckle and stood in a loose arc. Not praying, just agreeing to do the next right thing the slow way, with names ready and hands steady. Because the forest keeps its secrets unless you ask with the right mix of patience and math. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a low tone rose and fell, and no one could tell whether it was wind or memory preparing the ground to speak. They opened the ground the way you open a letter you've been dreading and needing in the same breath, slow, respectful, every motion narrated into a log so future grief would have a record to lean on. The anomalies at the knuckle resolved into what the tablet had promised: shaped soil. Edges too neat for weather. Layers that told a story of work done at night and covered by mornings that conspired. No spectacle, no cruelty paraded for a camera. Just the quiet arithmetic of recovery. The coroner's team said what teams say when words must do more than fill air. We will lift what we find with care. We will speak each name when we are certain. Days stretched, then shortened, the way days do when you measure them in identifications. 17 had been known from the bus, more joined them by match and by patience. Among the missing, 9 shrank to a number that didn't sting less but stung differently. Families stood at distances the deputies arrange. Allowed to see tools but not conclusions. Invited to put hands on shoulders when language failed. The artifacts deepened the pattern. The birch mask was one of several. The paracord scraps agreed with the ledger's tide marks. A rectangle of ground bore signs of a frame that had once held a tarp. Then nothing. What emerged wasn't ceremony. It was logistics, windows of drought used like appointments. Sound folded to hide footsteps. A discipline of repetition drilled into bodies until choice blurred. The investigators wrote it without adjective, administered scarcity, enforced rhythm, controlled departure. The county attorney underlined every place where craft replaced belief. Because belief is hard to prosecute and craft leaves invoices. When Mason was told that more names were certain, he set his elbows on the table and let his forehead find the heel of his hands. He didn't ask which names first. As if the order would be a judgment. He did ask where the spirals had led exactly, and when they showed him the lip of safer ground between the flood channels. He nodded like a man recognizing a view from a nightmare he'd outlived. He asked to give a statement to the families with no press present. The room they used was the campus recital hall because it had good acoustics for once, no microphones. Only the ordinary courage of a human voice. He said he was sorry in sentences that didn't try to buy forgiveness. That named his fear and did not dress it as fate. He said he left not because he was stronger but because a week of rain had made a door. He said he carried a disc to prove to himself that he would come back someday and that someday had taken too long. Claire's father, Thomas Monroe, waited until others spoke. He stood with a folded paper in his palm and didn't unfold it. Like a man who has memorized the words he can't yet survive saying. He talked about verbs. How he kept her in the present tense. How grief adjusted his grammar without permission. How past tense felt like a betrayal but sometimes read like a truth you can honor. He had not signed a declaration because he refused a state's nouns. But he placed the tip of his finger on the list the coroner provided and whispered his daughter's name as if practice could teach the mouth to do the hardest work. The room did what rooms do when a father teaches it how to hold silence. The college installed new brass plates along the lobby wall. Between them, they planted a thin row of saplings under grow lights until the soil outside thawed. Each tree wore a tag with a first and last name stamped by hand. Students who had arrived years after the loss took watering shifts and learned that care is a form of resistance. The outdoor program rewrote its handbook with redundancies, dual itineraries filed with rangers, passive beacons that check themselves in when humans can't. A rule that dusk is not an hour but a hazard designation. A faculty committee drafted a policy with language that survived debate. Challenge without coercion. Risk named and owned. Exit plans rehearsed the way we rehearse fire alarms. At the sawmill outbuilding, the ledger not ledger turned into a thread. A former foreman, tracked down in another state, denied and then softened, not into confession but into a shape near it. He admitted, weekend access jobs, paid in cash. He named no clients. He described hauling heavy equipment for people who lived light and minded their own. He blinked when shown the fare leads and said nothing when asked whether the river ever sounded like steel. The attorney wrote the kind of notes you write when the truth refuses to grow teeth. It might never hold in a courtroom. It held in the community, which sometimes is a different thing and sometimes is enough to keep people from drowning in why. The last gesture was small and mean and tender all at once. A yearbook, bleached by time, reappeared in the lobby display case, tucked under its back cover. A page with handwriting that every surviving friend recognized without needing a lab. We tried to leave. I'm sorry. M. Mason insisted it was his. Marcus's brother traced the initial with a thumb and said nothing because love turns people into good liars for the sake of one another's peace. The plaque in the hall took on a different shine. People began to touch the names less like relics and more like handles. Something to grip when the room tilts. Mason sat at the edge of the lake one evening with the MiniDisc in his pocket and didn't play it. The way you don't call a number you know by heart because you can't afford to hear the hello. Across the water, wind pushed a low tone through the trees. And he flinched, then deliberately didn't. Healing isn't courage or luck. Its repetition pointed in a kinder direction. He stood, walked the shore once, then twice, then back, counting his breaths, making a new cadence no one else would own. The next morning a ranger flagged a fresh spiral tied at eye level along an unmarked path, 2 turns. Then back, and for a second, everybody forgot that the forest isn't the one who leaves messages.